Hello, welcome back to Catholic Reboot. Typically what I'll do is I will discuss something about the faith. The whole purpose of this podcast is to try to provide a reboot of our faith for any of those that may have forgotten, for any of the younger Catholics that were never taught, right? So, my attempt is to reboot our Catholic faith and maybe just get you thinking about it. So if you said, "Wow, yeah, that's kind of a departure from what I thought or what I learned," rather than beating it in, it's more of a case where I want you to say, maybe I need to do a deeper dive and find out more about that, right? So you'll hear me quite often contrast our Catholic faith pre and post Vatican II. Well, I think I can drive that home even more with this episode. Now, this episode is called "In Defense of the Millennial Catholics." Okay, and I had written a book. I was in my mid 40s when I wrote it. It was called "The Fall of Man." And the reason I wrote it is I started seeing a big change later in my life. When you're younger, in your late 20s and 30s, you're kind of focused on just trying to make a living and raise kids. I think once you get into your 40s, you kind of go through a little bit of contemplation. By the time in your 50s, you just kind of either say, "Boy, I really blew it," or "I need to make up for it." When you get in your 60s, now I'm 60, you start saying, "I better do something." So we all go through these stages in our life. But back to that book. In that book, I was drawing the comparison of what happened to men in our culture, right? And what happened to our church since Vatican II, and has it drastically changed not only how we raise our families, how we practice our faith, but how our culture is developed, right? It's not a very long book. I think it's kind of a simplistic thought process, but I wanted to get it out. So as I was traveling a lot for work, I'd get on a plane and I'd kick out another chapter. One of the points I was making in that book was my parents' generation was called the greatest generation, and I'm going to go through all the different generations to make the point, but they were the greatest generation because they had to suffer through the Depression and one of the greatest wars in our country, which was World War II, and they created this new society, and then us baby boomers came out of that generation, right? Well, I'd like to say that my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, the order was always God first, country second, culture last, right? What started to happen in my parents' generation, the greatest generation, is it started to go God, country, and culture together, right? Because there was this new culture, this new thinking that was going on. When my generation came around, the baby boomers, God slipped to second place, and it was actually culture, God, country. I would say after that time, you just started seeing the order going culture, country. God fell off the map altogether. And today I think we are just 100% culture, right? All right. Now, like Billy Joel says in his song, we didn't start the fire, right? It's been burning since the world's been turning. Okay, let's think about that. Whenever God had enough, when a culture became nothing more than self-serving, and then in so being, because of its humanism, it just goes afoul because it takes God out of the equation. God had to do his master reboot, right? So either completely destroying a town in the way of Sodom and Gomorrah, or prior to that, completely destroying the earth through a flood like Noah, or maybe a little bit more genteel by taking the Jews into the desert and letting them wander 40 years. Now, that one's a great one because what was God signifying? It would take 40 years to get that thinking out of the population. And if you look at the way I compare all the changes post-Vatican II, go to 1965 to 2005, that would be the period that you would take away, okay? And it's really amazing where we would be if we viewed our structure, our view of God, country, and culture. Well, what I think many Catholics, now the baby boomers and any of those that are still around prior to the baby boomers, actually there's a period where it's the greatest generation, then baby boomers. There's actually a generation in between. I think they were called the silent generation. But if any of those generations were asked, what do they remember growing up in the way of pornography, illicit readings, illicit movies, they'll tell you that the church was actually very involved in all of it. So since there were so many Catholics, film producers had to be careful that their movie didn't end up on the list of what not to watch for Catholics, because then they're doomed, right? The other thing was, as Catholics, we really could not read certain religious writings unless there was what they called an ecclesiastic seal of some kind on it, which denoted it was from the church, right? Now, many of you may say, oh my gosh, that's like book burning. No, the concept was this: don't expose yourself or your children to things that could corrupt them. That was the idea, right? All right, so what ended up happening? And this is why I have a lot of concern about Vatican II. After Vatican II, almost all of that went away. No longer was the church printing a list of movies we shouldn't see. No longer was the church saying there's certain books, both secular books and religious books, we shouldn't read. You know, no longer was the church even standing up against social injustices or evils such as homosexuality and abortion. In other words, the church pulls way back after Vatican II and kind of lets our culture go into a free fall, right? Which is the most disastrous thing of all. Now, it doesn't take much, and the reason I say this episode is called In Defense of Millennials is, what do we expect when previous generations drop the ball, right? So let me be very specific. The baby boomers cannot be accused of allowing for Vatican II if they were too young, right? That was allowed through the greatest generation. And that's why in my book, The Fall of Man, I say I think I'd reclassify that generation. Although they did a lot of great things, they gave away our Mass, they gave away a lot of our sacred traditions, which caused this movement away from God as number one to eventually God off the list altogether. And you'd say, are you kidding? I mean, you're going to attack your parents? And for some of the people who may be listening to this, they're grandparents, right? And I'd say, yeah, because stop and think, what was the divorce rate like prior to Vatican II? What was single parents like prior to Vatican II? What was the loss to suicide prior to Vatican II? And I'm just going to take those three. Well, no, let me add another one. What was the loss of the religious and the faithful in practicing their faith prior to Vatican II? And we all know the numbers. Divorce skyrocketed up to 50 to 65%. Single parents skyrocketed to 50 to 60%. Loss of faith or leaving the faith went up to 60, 70%. Loss of the religious was cataclysmic. I mean, it just, the number of men and women either entering the religious orders or specifically priests being ordained today is pitiful, right? So you'd say, well, this sounds like a downer episode, and it's really not, because as God had taken the Jews into the desert to get their mind right, you know, great line from Cool Hand Luke, got to get your mind right, Luke. I think our generation, so let me place this on the boomers for a minute. We spent a lot of time introducing the technologies, right? That we are responsible. So we introduced all the technologies. I know from the time I was working in public accounting, I brought home the first PC. What did my daughters grow up with? All of it, all the technology. I was teaching them. They were learning as well from their friends' parents. So our generation brought that into the house, right? And I would say that was a drastic change, because if the church is no longer assisting us and being careful what our children are exposed to, what do we expose them to? The internet, right? And so in essence, unless we kept our eye on them, when we were growing up, the worst you could do is see a dirty book or a magazine that someone would hide away. There wasn't this mass distribution around the world. Our kids started growing up being able to see all this perversion firsthand as fast as possible. And if you look at, in the case of my grandchildren, by the time they're 2 years old, their parents are handing them iPads or iPhones, and they're streaming through all this information that once was prohibited from being seen is being made available. How in the world can they not be influenced by it? You know, I used to say it's no different than taking your child or your grandchild, dropping them off in the seediest neighborhood on the seediest corner and saying, hey, have a nice day. You know, there's no control, right? Now, what else started coming about in the, I'm going to say, 80s and 90s is the culture dictated. No longer the church, no longer the parents. The culture took over for both the church and the parents, and all of a sudden mothers started providing their daughters and maybe their sons with some form of birth control. All of a sudden abortion was no longer evil, it was acceptable. No longer was having homosexual relationships evil, it was acceptable. All this culture created was nothing is bad as long as you feel it's good, right? So again, you're saying, where's the defense for the millennials? I think that as we complain about these millennials and say, I don't know why they act the way they do, I don't know why they don't work as hard as us, I don't know why their value system is so selfish, we point back to us, and us, we, the boomers, point back to our parents' generation. Why? We allowed for the slow slipping away. And I actually feel sorry for millennials. And I'm actually going to put up a chart of all the generations because I don't want to diss the Generation Xers. And I think it's the Alpha generation. But I'm specifically focusing on the baby boomers and the millennials. And I think selfishly so because my daughters are millennials. So I take direct responsibility for that. And I say, you know, I had gone to, I go to a traditional mass, and I'm really full of joy when I walk in and I see millennials with their kids, because I think, you can't find my generation in church as much, let alone in a traditional mass, right? And the other thing that's really uplifting is I'm starting to see more children, right? they're getting away from our generation of 2.5 kids or 1.5 kids, and they're starting to be fruitful and multiply, and they're having kids, right? And so I would say the reason this dovetails nicely into my podcast on the Catholic Reboot is I don't want these episodes to come off like I'm dictating or saying, shame on you for not knowing your catechism, shame on you for not knowing your councils of the church, shame on you for not understanding the difference of venial sin or a mortal sin, or all the elements of the Mass, or all the elements of confession. Quite the opposite. I'm actually saying, in a mea culpa gesture, right? We blew it. We owe to our children a reboot. We have got to stop thinking we are their friends. You know, I have a 95-year-old father. He will never consider himself my friend. He will always consider himself as my father. And to the day he dies, he will say to me, what are you thinking? Right? You know, get your head on right. And that's really the first and foremost responsibility of a parent, is to be the guardian, not the friend, right? And I would have to say my generation wanted to become their kids' friends, and they started letting everything go, right? And then when I even look at, like, my daughter's generation, the children they're having, right? How is this ever going to change if the millennials aren't explained what it is we stole from them? And we stole a lot from them, okay? We need to go back, and we need, especially at our later age, before we meet our Maker, we got to get vested in our kids. And we got to get vested strongly. Now, they have every right to say, oh, great, now you want to start, when I didn't hear any of this growing up. Again, you got to see, I blew this one, right? In a big way, right? So what is the process of doing that? Well, it's kind of complicated, to be honest, because it's almost like when God took the Jews in the desert for 40 years. I would say our children, our millennial children, have to take their family in the desert, not the physical desert, in the cultural desert now and moving forward, and pretty much say, I think we have to start this over. Now, there's some things the millennials do that I think they got it right. You notice they're really not big on possessions. I think they looked at their parents saying, you were so worried about both mom and dad working. The house had to be great. It had to be bigger. We had these McMansions. Everyone has to have a car. I see the millennials kind of falling back saying, what did that get? What did that get us? You know, we were lonely. You know, there wasn't a lot of involvement. The other thing I see with millennials is, and thank God for this, I had seen way young into my career, corporate America is a cesspool, you know. And the millennials, although what they're involved in today, I don't know how they even show up to work in corporate America, because it's nothing, one big cultural brainwash. But they surely aren't putting their time in the way we did. We used to work crazy hours. We gave up our life for our job, and I see the millennials saying, I'm going to work just enough to, you know, to get through what I need. So where we basically live to work, millennials are just working to live. They're just doing what they need to do, and they're getting back to more social skills. Those things that I remember growing up with, which were grandparents and parents and family around the table, getting together, spending more time together. My generation, all of a sudden, everything was excluded. Had to have everything systematic. When are you getting together? Who's coming over? They ring the doorbell when they're not supposed to, you know. And I'm seeing the millennials saying we didn't like that growing up, and we're not doing that. So I think what we need to do as boomers, right? If any of the silent generation and the greatest generation are still around, get them involved too, right? Give these great deposits of the faith we were so fortunate to receive, right? Now, I would say my parents received a lot more than our generation, but our generation were probably the last. I'd like to say, instead of calling us boomers, call us the last generation, because we were privileged enough to remember the traditions of the family, remember the traditions of our culture, remember the traditions of our country, and most importantly, remember the traditions of our faith, right? So let's bring it back. And let's not make it so dry, but exciting and informative, and set up those times to have discussions with it. These young kids, these little kids, you can just see them beaming if you pull that iPad away from them and have a discussion with them, because they're so used to their parents doing this. Yeah, I'll be right there. Yeah, no, don't do that. That if you stop, say, put that away. Hey, how was your day today? Okay, what did you do? All of a sudden they're like, oh my gosh, right? What a perfect time to say, hey, do you know all the different types of angels? Because they're inquisitive. No, start teaching them these things. Start explaining these things. Get away from this concern about your 401k and are you going to be set up for retirement. That's so boomerish. That's such a me generation. I'm good. I don't really care what's going on in your world. Let's start getting involved with our kids and our grandkids. And let's start providing a spiritual basis for them. And it couldn't hurt to say, let's go to Mass again together, right? The other thing is, and I'm going to bash the Catholic Church, okay? Let's start forcing our religious to start teaching the true deposits of the faith that give us the inspiration to follow the faith. We don't want happy priests. Everything's happy. Are you feeling good about... No, that's not what we need. No. Matter of fact, I've seen quite a few priests that get up there and tell it like it is and educate. Next thing you know, they're gone. Because this touchy-feely world we're in, people are reporting to the bishops pull them. Why? Because everything's happy. Everything is not happy. We can be joyful, but we need to educate. And we need to educate on the principles. And that's why I'll say it couldn't hurt for parents to purchase, and I would say Baltimore Catechism, a catechism before Vatican II, and instead of letting their kids watch Disney, instead of let them get on the iPod, say, put that away. We're going to go through a couple things. Make it interesting. Don't make it boring. Teach them the faith. You millennials, I'm going to say, you are going to produce the greatest generation of saints in our church. I believe it. Christ and the Holy Spirit are going to raise them up out of your generation. Take all this negativity about how they're blasting your generation and say, you know what, you guys blew it, we're not going to blow it. We're going to fix the most important thing, and that's the deposit of faith that you guys let go. We are not going to raise our children the way you raised us. We're millennials. We're going to be the greatest generation of Catholics care about economics, okay? The greatest generation of Catholics. And to do that, you may have to do some hard work, but you're still young enough. You got the energy. Do the hard work. So that's it. And again, I'll put some tiles up. But I just want to make it quick because I really feel disingenuous when I do these episodes, because there's this haunting thing inside me that says they won't even follow you. They don't even know what you're talking about, let alone what you had. So I apologize. What we had, we didn't give you. Okay, so sorry, and see you in the next episode.